The invitation had not been extended to Earth. Not really. The document said otherwise, of course. It used the correct diplomatic language, the kind that sounded warm on paper and meant nothing in practice. But everyone who had spent more than 5 minutes inside a conclave briefing room knew what the annual Grand Military Symposium truly was. It was a mirror. The strongest species held it up, looked at themselves, and smiled. The weaker ones were allowed to stand at the edge of the frame, so the reflection looked fuller. Humanity had been standing at that edge for 20 years. The station Arvith 9 floated at the midpoint of the conclave's inner corridor, a place chosen because it belonged to no single species, which in practice meant it belonged to the Sorathi Imperium, since they had funded 3/4 of its construction. It was enormous by human standards and modest by Sorathi ones, which told you everything about the relationship between those two facts. Its docking rings stretched out like the spokes of a wheel, and at any given hour during the symposium, warships from 11 different civilizations were locked into those rings, gleaming and silent and communicating power without saying a word. The ISV Resolute arrived on the 3rd day of the gathering period. It did not announce itself loudly. It came in on a standard approach vector, filed its docking credentials through the correct channels, and settled into Ring 7 without incident. The docking log registered it as Earth vessel, classification unknown, crew complement classified, armament classification pending review. The conclave's intake officer flagged it for a secondary review, saw that Earth had submitted the appropriate provisional member waivers, and moved on to the next ship. There were 43 other vessels to process. No one on Arvith 9 knew what the Resolute was. That was not an accident. Fleet Warden Orath gave his address on the 4th day, in the great hall that the Sorathi had also largely paid for. He was tall even by Sorathi standards, with the flat, pale eyes of a species that had evolved in deep ocean trenches and carried that coldness into everything they did. His uniform was dark and precise. He spoke the common tongue of the conclave without accent and without warmth, which was considered a mark of discipline in his culture. He praised the gathered fleets. He praised the conclave's unity. He spoke of the long peace that military strength had preserved, and of the obligations that came with membership in an alliance as great and as old as this one. Then, near the end, he said something that was not quite an insult and was entirely one. Every species present, he said, has demonstrated its commitment through contribution. The strength of this conclave is not merely political. It is measured, it is weighed, and it is sustained only by those willing to carry their share of the burden, not simply to benefit from it. He did not look at the human delegation when he said it. He did not need to. Every other delegation did. Ambassador Lyra Vasine sat in the 3rd row of the human section and watched Orath finish his speech to a long, rolling sound of approval from the assembled commanders. She had a narrow face and dark eyes that gave nothing away. She had been giving nothing away in rooms like this for 11 years. It had become a kind of skill, the ability to absorb a thing completely, to feel the full weight of it, and to let none of that weight show on the surface. She did not look at the Resolute's docking ring feed on her personal display. She did not need to check if it was there. She knew it was there. Orath finished. The applause continued. Vasine put her hands together and made the motion of clapping without producing sound, which was the diplomatic equivalent of saying nothing at all. That evening, in one of Arvith 9's lower observation corridors, a group of Sorathi tactical officers were reviewing the exercise roster for Phase 1. One of them pulled up the list of participating vessels and read through it with the specific kind of boredom that comes from already knowing how everything will end. His eyes moved past the Resolute entry twice before something made him go back. He read the classification fields, all blank. He ran a cross-reference search through the conclave's shared military registry. Nothing. He tried Earth-submitted fleet manifests from the past 6 years. The Resolute did not appear in any of them. He showed it to the officer beside him, who shrugged and said Earth had probably submitted a single ship by mistake. The first officer laughed and agreed. He filed a low-priority query to the intake office and forgot about it. On the Resolute, Admiral Dora Reyes was not sleeping. She was sitting in the narrow observation alcove at the rear of Deck 2, which was not an official station and was barely large enough for one person to sit comfortably. She had found it on her second week aboard and had not told anyone about it. The viewport there was unobstructed and faced aft, which meant she could see where the ship had been rather than where it was going. She was 53 years old. She had gray at both temples and the kind of posture that came not from military training, but from a lifetime of deciding that the ground beneath her feet was going to hold, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. She had spent 11 years attending conclave briefings where human reports were received politely, filed without comment, and never discussed again. She had watched 3 human fleet squadrons enter these exercises full of confidence and leave with nothing but the memory of how fast it had gone wrong. She was not full of confidence. She was full of something quieter and more durable than that. Rolf Stenger found her there because he had learned, in the 8 months since he had served under her, that when she was not on the bridge and not in her quarters, she was in the alcove. He was a large man who moved carefully, the habit of someone who had spent formative years in low-gravity environments where a careless step could send you into a wall. He stood in the corridor outside the alcove because there was genuinely no room for him inside it. "We're on the Phase 2 roster," he said. "Corridor 7. Reyes did not turn around immediately. She watched the distant lights of Arvith 9 reflected on the hull of a Sorathi cruiser 2 rings over. It was a beautiful ship, genuinely beautiful. The Sorathi had been building warships for 400 years and they showed it. "I know," she said. "Orath requested it for us specifically." "I know that too." Stenger was quiet for a moment. Outside, the stars did not move. "You're not worried," he said. It was not a question. "No." She finally turned to look at him. Her expression was the same one she wore in briefing rooms, not hard, not closed, just settled, like a door that had been properly fitted to its frame. "They've spent 20 years telling us exactly what they're afraid of," she said. "We just had to listen." Stenger looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he does not have anything to add because nothing needs adding. He left. Reyes turned back to the viewport. The Resolute held its berth in Ring 7, quiet and dark and patient. While the rest of Arvith 9 went on preparing for a show it thought it already knew the ending of. The first phase of the Grand Military Symposium ran for 2 days, and for 2 days it was exactly what everyone expected it to be. The Sorathi Imperium fleet moved through the exercise corridors like something that had been doing this long enough to make it look effortless, which it had. Their strike formations were clean and coordinated in the way that only comes from 4 centuries of institutional memory. They used a flanking pattern called the Trident Collapse, named after some ancient Sorathi naval battle that every conclave tactical student was required to study. It worked as it always worked, as it had worked for 200 years without a single meaningful counter emerging from any member species. The Durin Collective performed with their usual mechanical precision. They did not improvise, but they did not need to. Their strength was endurance. Their ships could take more punishment than anything else in the exercise and keep moving. A Durin formation under fire looked like water finding its level. It absorbed the pressure, shifted, and kept its shape. The Velhari came third and were admired by almost everyone. They were a species that had turned tactics into something closer to art. Their ships moved in patterns that seemed decorative, until you realized the decorative element was also covering every possible angle of approach. They won a great deal of applause in the observation gallery, and their commander received it with the still, composed expression of someone who expected applause, and had decided long ago that it was insufficient recognition. Then there were the humans. The Resolute was listed on the Phase 1 roster as an observer with restricted participation. The official reason was that its classification status had not been fully processed through the conclave's intake system. The unofficial reason, which no one said aloud but everyone understood, was that no one knew what it was, and the exercise coordinators did not want an unknown variable disrupting the early phases of what was supposed to be an orderly demonstration of conclave military strength. So the Resolute sat at the outer edge of the exercise boundary and watched. It did not transmit. It did not hail any other vessel. Its sensor array was running, which was expected and permitted, but it ran quietly, and its output was not being shared with any other ship in the corridor. The exercise coordinator noted this as slightly unusual but within the allowable parameters for a participating vessel in observer status. Fleet Warden Oreth spent both days in the main observation gallery with his senior staff arranged around him like a frame around a painting. He offered tactical commentary during the exercises, not because anyone had asked for it, but because the gallery was full of junior commanders from smaller member species, and there was political value, specifically, in being the person who explained what was happening to those who were still learning to understand it. He was good at this. He had a clear, measured voice and a genuine depth of knowledge, and he used both to cement the impression that the Sorathi Imperium was not simply the strongest fleet in the conclave, but also the most thoughtful one. During the second day's afternoon session, he referenced the Resolute by the wrong registry number. He did not correct himself. His aide, sitting 2 seats to his right, caught the error and made a note to correct it in the transcript. Then she looked at the registry number she had written down for the correction and realized she was not entirely sure of the right number either. She pulled up the intake log, found it, fixed the transcript, and moved on. It was a small thing. It was also, though she did not think of it this way, a symptom. No one in the Sorathi delegation had spent any real effort learning about the Resolute. There had been no intelligence assessment of Earth's current shipbuilding programs in the past 4 years. The last report in their archive, dated 38 months ago, described Earth's military development as mid-tier by conclave standards, with no notable innovations anticipated in the next decade. The officer who wrote it had spent 9 days on the assessment and considered it thorough. Aboard the Resolute, no one was watching the observation gallery feeds. There was work to do. Priya Nand had been awake for most of the first phase. Not because she was required to be, but because she was the kind of engineer who treated sleep as a thing to be scheduled after all reasonable doubt had been removed from her systems, and doubt had not yet been fully removed from her compression fold assembly. The fold drive was not a jump drive. It did not move the ship from one point in space to another. What it did was more precise and considerably harder to explain to anyone who did not already understand the underlying physics. The simplest version was this. It made the ship appear to be in a slightly different position than it actually was, for a window of 4 to 11 seconds, depending on the power allocation. During that window, anything targeting the ship's projected position would be targeting empty space. Nand had run 41 diagnostics on the assembly since they had docked at Arvath 9. She was running the 42nd. Down in the tactical bay, Nessa Rourke was not running diagnostics. She was reading. She had pulled every recorded after-action report that human commanders had submitted following previous conclave exercises. 17 reports across 3 symposiums, all of them filed in the correct format, all of them submitted through the correct channels, all of them available in the conclave's shared archive, and apparently read by no one outside of Earth's own Defense Review Board. The reports were detailed. They identified weaknesses in conclave tactical patterns. They noted vulnerabilities in sensor relay architecture that multiple species shared, apparently because they had all sourced similar components from the same Duran manufacturing network 3 decades ago. They suggested specific countermaneuvers. They were, in short, exactly the kind of material that a serious military alliance would discuss seriously and either implement or formally refute. They had been filed, acknowledged with a standard receipt, and left untouched. Rourke read them carefully, all the way through, for the second time. She had first read them 6 months ago, when she was assigned to the Resolute and given access to the full tactical brief. She was reading them again now because she believed that important things deserved to be read more than once, and because she wanted to make sure she remembered every detail of what the conclave had been told and chosen not to hear. Rolf Stenger found her there, the same way he found most people on the ship, by walking the corridors at irregular intervals in the manner of someone who liked to know where things were. He looked at her screen, saw the report headings, and did not say anything immediately. "You've already read those," he said eventually. "Twice," she said, "about to be 3 times." He considered this, nervous. "No," she said, "just making sure." The Phase 2 roster was posted that evening. Stenger read it in the tactical bay and then walked to the alcove at the rear of Deck 2, where Reyes was sitting in the near-dark reading through the same roster on a small display she held in one hand. He stood in the corridor and confirmed what she already knew. Corridor 7, 3 Sorathi warships, the hardest assignment in the exercise. Orath had reviewed the Phase 2 assignments personally before they were submitted. He had looked at the list of available vessels and the available corridors, and he had placed the Resolute in Corridor 7 because it would produce a quick, clean result that could be referenced for the rest of the symposium. He expected the Resolute to enter, take fire, and be tagged as combat eliminated inside 6 minutes. He thought it would be instructive for the smaller member species watching. A demonstration, he had told his aide, of the importance of proven capability over mere participation. He had not considered the possibility that Reyes had been waiting for Corridor 7 for a long time, not because she had known it would be offered to her specifically, but because she had prepared for every corridor, in the way that someone prepares when they know they will get exactly one chance and intend to use it fully. The Resolute powered up its systems in Ring 7's berth. Priya Nand ran her 43rd diagnostic and found nothing wrong. Rourke put down her reading and moved to her station. Stenger took his position without being told. Reyes walked onto the bridge and sat in the command chair in the unhurried way of someone who has already done the hard part of the job, which is the deciding, and is now simply carrying out what was decided. She said nothing for a moment, then she said, "Let's go." The Resolute undocked cleanly and moved toward the exercise corridor, while the rest of the symposium went on around it, enormous and indifferent and entirely unprepared for what was about to happen in a stretch of simulated space that Orath had chosen, because he thought it would be over quickly. He was right about that part at least. The 3 Sorathi warships entered Corridor 7 from the north vector, moving in a standard spread formation, the kind they used when the expected engagement would be brief. It was not an insult in any conscious sense. It was simply what you used when you did not think you needed anything more. Their commander was a fleet rank officer named Sav Durath, a veteran of 9 exercises and 2 actual border engagements at the edge of conclave space. He was not famous, but he was competent, and among the Sorathi, competence was measured in a very specific way, by how cleanly and efficiently you handled whatever was in front of you. He had reviewed the Resolute's entry file before the exercise began. Classification unknown, armament pending. He had noted it the way a surgeon might note a minor variant in anatomy. Interesting, possibly, but not meaningfully different in the end. He expected to see the Resolute come in fast, weapons already tracking, the way human vessels had come in every previous exercise. Aggressive, uncoordinated, emotional. He had the counter for that already prepared. The Resolute did not come in fast. It entered the corridor at reduced speed, well within standard engagement range, and then it stopped. Not drifted, stopped, with deliberate thruster correction holding it exactly in place. Its active sensor arrays shut down. From the Sorathi targeting systems, it appeared as a vessel that had possibly just experienced a systems failure. Durath waited 11 seconds. Then he ordered his ships to begin a targeting solution and fire on the Resolute's position. The first salvo crossed the corridor in under 2 seconds. All 3 strikes hit empty space. The Resolute was not where it had been. It had not moved, not in the way a ship moves when it fires its drives. There had been no engine output, no drive signature, no change in the position data that the Sorathi targeting systems had been reading up until the moment the weapons fired. The ship had simply appeared to shift, slightly, the way a reflection shifts when the water beneath it is disturbed. The Sorathi tactical officer staring at her targeting screen made a sound that was not quite a word. She ran a recalibration. The targeting system reported nominal. The Resolute was sitting 10 meters off from where it had been 4 seconds ago, which should not have been possible without a drive output. She did not have time to report this before the Resolute actually moved this time, drives firing, in a direction Dureth had not anticipated. Not toward them and not away. Diagonal to the engagement axis, toward the left flank of the spread formation, which was the position of the Sorathi ship with the oldest sensor relay hardware. A fact that had been noted in a human after-action report 8 years and 4 months ago. In the observation gallery on Arvith 9, someone had turned the Corridor 7 feed on a large secondary display. It had been a minor decision. The main display was running the more prestigious engagement in Corridor 3, where the Velhari were performing their patterned formations for a crowd that had already been admiring them for 20 minutes. The Corridor 7 feed was background noise. It stopped being background noise very quickly. Fleet Warden Orath was mid-sentence, explaining a point about the Durin Collective's energy management to a junior commander from one of the smaller member species, when the officer to his left quietly put a hand on the display and enlarged the Corridor 7 feed. Orath stopped talking. He looked at it. The Resolute was moving through the Sorathi formation in a way that the tactical grid was struggling to represent cleanly. The targeting solution updates were running 4 seconds behind because the ship's apparent position kept generating a discrepancy with its actual position, and the system was not built to handle a ship that consistently appeared to be somewhere slightly other than where it was. The Sorathi ships were firing. They were firing accurately, by every standard the system recognized. They were simply not hitting anything. Dureth ordered a course correction and a new spread pattern, a wider net, designed to cover more space and eliminate the margin of error. The Resolute was already gone from the position the new pattern was designed for. It had not retreated. It was sitting closer than before, just off the port quarter of his center ship, in a position that was technically inside the minimum safe distance for the spread pattern he had just ordered. His own ships could not fire on it without risking simulated damage to each other. He canceled the order. He took 2 seconds to think. Reyes gave him one. She did not say anything. She looked at her tactical display, looked at the position of the first Sorathi ship and said a number to Stenger, a targeting coordinate. He entered it without asking for clarification. Reyes said, "Sensor relay, low yield." The simulated strike tagged the first Sorathi ship's sensor relay cluster, a component that sat on the outer hull at the junction of the main array and the secondary backup, a position that generated a structural weak point, a fact that had been in the human report and had never been addressed because no one had ever needed to address it. The exercise system registered the ship's sensor capability as reduced by 60%. A ship with 60% sensor reduction in a corridor engagement was effectively fighting with its eyes half closed. The first Sorathi ship began moving erratically as its targeting system tried to compensate for the sensor gap. Dureth, watching this from his position in the center ship, adjusted his formation to compensate. It was a good adjustment, fast and logical. It would have worked against a standard opponent. Stenger was already looking at the adjustment and telling Reyes where the second ship would need to be to maintain formation integrity. She nodded. Rourke, at the secondary station, confirmed it before he finished speaking. They had run this scenario in simulation 44 times in the months before the symposium. not Corridor 7 specifically. The Sorathi formation responds to a sensor-degraded wingship specifically. The second ship moved to exactly where Stenger said it would move. The Resolute was waiting for it. The second ship's sensor relay went down 4 seconds after the first. In the observation gallery, the commentary had stopped. Oreth's commentary had stopped. The junior commander he had been speaking to had turned fully around to face the Corridor 7 display. Several other conversations around the room had also stopped, not all at once but one by one, as people noticed what was happening, and the noticing spread like something moving through still water. Council Speaker Duvan, who had been reviewing a diplomatic brief in a seat near the rear of the gallery, looked up when the room went quiet. He looked at the display. He folded the brief closed. Durath, working with one ship fully operational and 2 running on degraded sensors, made the right call. He ordered a fallback to the secondary vector, a defensive position his formation used when an engagement was going wrong and needed to be reset. It was a sensible, professional decision. Every Sorathi commander was trained to use it. The vector coordinates were standard, pulled from the doctrine manual that every Sorathi fleet officer memorized during their second year of command school. The Resolute was at the secondary vector when Durath's ships arrived there. It had not followed them. It had not chased them. It had simply been there in position before they began moving, because Reyes had identified the fallback vector from the Sorathi Doctrine Manual, which was not classified, which had been in Earth's tactical database for 6 years, and because she had calculated that a formation with 2 sensor-degraded ships and a corridor axis that had already gone wrong would default to that vector before Durath consciously chose it. The exercise system registered all 3 Sorathi warships as combat eliminated at the 17-minute mark. No hull damage to the Resolute. No crew casualties, simulated or otherwise. All systems nominal. Stenger sat back in his chair and rolled his neck once, side to side. Rourke let out a long breath through her nose that she had apparently been holding for some time. Nan sent a single message from the engineering bay. 2 words, no punctuation. Reyes sat still. She looked at the tactical display for a moment after the exercise system confirmed the result, and then she looked out through the forward viewport at the corridor around them. Empty now, the Sorathi ships already processing the outcome data and beginning to pull back. Then she opened a channel to the exercise coordinator and said, in the same tone you use when you are reading a grocery list, that Corridor 7 had been completed and that the Resolute was available for reassignment. The exercise coordinator acknowledged the transmission. There was a pause of about 4 seconds before the acknowledgement came, which was longer than usual. On Arvath 9, in the observation gallery, the Corridor 7 display was now the only one most people were looking at. The main display, with its elegant Velhari formations, had become secondary somehow, the way a painting becomes secondary when something real has entered the room. Fleet Warden Oreth looked at the final engagement summary on the tactical grid. He looked at it for a long time. His aide waited for him to say something. He did not say anything. He stood up quietly and walked out of the gallery. The room watched him go. Then it looked back at the display, where the outcome was still sitting in plain text, waiting to be processed. Corridor 7, engagement complete. ISV Resolute, active. SORT HFY VSSLS 1, 2. 3 ELMINATD. Duration, 17 MINUTES 4 seconds. It was a simple sentence. It sat on the screen without drama or decoration. And the room, full of the finest military minds of 11 civilizations, did not make a sound. Word travels fast on a station the size of Arvath 9, and in a gathering the size of the Grand Military Symposium, it travels faster than that. Not through official channels, those moved at the pace of procedure, with forms and confirmations and the deliberate slowness of institutions that had learned not to react quickly to things they had not yet understood. Word traveled through the informal channels, the corridor conversations, the shared mess halls, the side rooms where junior officers from different species sat together and talked in the way that junior officers always talk when their senior staff is not nearby. By the time the formal afternoon exercises ended, every delegation on Arvith 9 knew what had happened in Corridor 7. Not all the details, the exercise system's full breakdown was still being compiled, but the essential fact, the one that mattered, the human ship had gone into the hardest corridor in the exercise against 3 Sorathi warships and had not lost. It had not survived by luck or by error on the other side. It had won cleanly, methodically, without taking a single point of simulated damage in 17 minutes. The Conclave's tactical analysts were given the engagement data within 2 hours of the result. There were 6 of them, from 4 different species, and they were good at their jobs. They pulled the Resolute's movement data first, because the position anomaly that Dureth's tactical officer had reported was the thing that made the least sense, and in analytical work you start with what makes the least sense. The compression fold was not in any database they had access to. Not under that name, not under any name. They identified what it did produced a discrepancy between projected and actual position during a precise window of vulnerability, but the mechanism behind it was not familiar, and they could not reverse engineer it from the engagement footage alone. They flagged it for deeper review, wrote a note recommending that Earth's drive technology be formally assessed, and moved on to the tactical decisions. The tactical decisions were where it became uncomfortable. The analysts worked through the engagement in sequence, rebuilding it maneuver by maneuver, and they kept finding the same thing. The Resolute's choices had not been reactive. They had been predictive. The ship had been in position before it should have been in position, covering angles before those angles became relevant, targeting vulnerabilities before the vulnerabilities had been exposed in the engagement. The team lead set down her stylus at one point and said, out loud, to no one in particular, that the Resolute had fought as if it already knew exactly what the Sorathi ships were going to do. One of the junior analysts ran a search through the Conclave's shared archive, not the military registry, the full archive, which included all submitted reports from all member species over the past 30 years. He searched for references to Sorathi sensor relay vulnerabilities. He got 17 results. 14 of them were from Earth. The earliest was dated 9 years ago. He showed the results to the team lead. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at the engagement footage again, specifically at the moment the Resolute's first strike had hit the sensor relay cluster on the first Sorathi ship, not the weapons array, not the engines, not the hull. The sensor relay. She pulled the earliest Earth report. It described the vulnerability in detail. It suggested a targeting solution. It recommended that affected species upgrade the relay housing or restructure the external mount. It was signed by a human commander whose name she did not recognize. At the bottom, the standard archive receipt showed it had been logged, processed, and filed. There was no follow-up notation, no review record, no discussion entry. She put the report down and did not say anything for a while. Fleet Warden Orath spent 3 hours in his delegation's private quarters after leaving the observation gallery. He was not seen during that time, which was unusual enough that his aide noted it, and the aide's notation was unusual enough that it was later included in the Sorathi delegation's official record of the symposium, which was not the kind of thing that usually made it into official records. When he emerged, he called his senior intelligence officer to a private meeting. He asked for a complete assessment of Earth's military development, not the 4-year-old report, a new one, drawn from everything the Sorathi had collected in the interim. His intelligence officer told him carefully that the interim collection was limited, that there had been no active monitoring of Earth's shipbuilding programs for approximately 3 years, that the existing assessment had not been prioritized for renewal because Earth's military status was considered stable and non-threatening. Oreth listened to this in silence. He asked what limited meant, specifically. His intelligence officer told him that the Sorathi delegation's current file on Earth's active fleet composition was essentially what Earth had submitted in its official conclave documentation, the same documentation that listed the Resolute as classification unknown. Oreth told his officer to begin a full assessment immediately, using every channel available. His officer said it would take time. Oreth said he understood that. His voice was the same as it always was, flat and precise. But his officer had served under him for 6 years and recognized something in the way he delivered the instruction. He had heard it once before, after a border incident that had not gone the way anyone expected. It was the sound of a man revising a large assumption. Ambassador Vasin received a request for an informal meeting from 3 different delegation heads before dinner. She accepted all 3, organized them into a sequence, and spent the pre-dinner hour moving from one side room to another on Arvith 9's diplomatic level. The conversations were polite. They were also direct in the way that conversations become direct when the people having them are trying to understand something that has disrupted their model of the world. Each delegation head asked her a version of the same questions. How long had the Resolute been operational? What was its classification? Were there more like it? Vasin answered the first question honestly. 18 months. The response in each room was the same, a pause, a recalibration, and then a follow-up question, because 18 months meant the ship had been built and deployed within a window that none of them had been watching. She answered the second question by saying the classification was an Earth internal matter that had not yet been submitted to the conclave review process, which was technically true and entirely uninformative. She answered the third question with a smile that was warm, genuine, and completely opaque, and said that she was not in a position to discuss Earth's fleet composition. She then offered tea, which she had thought to bring with her, and which had the effect of making the conversation feel cordial while firmly closing the door on further inquiry. The meeting she had not requested came late in the evening, through a formal channel. Council Speaker Duvan wished to speak with her at her convenience. She replied that she was available immediately. Duvan was old for his species, which was saying something. The Thalori measured age in geological terms, loosely speaking, and Duvan carried it in the deep lines of his face and the slowness of his movements, which were not the slowness of weakness, but of someone who had learned that most situations did not require speed. He met her in a side chamber off the main diplomatic corridor, with no aides present, which told her this was a conversation he wanted on record nowhere. He did not open with the Corridor 7 result. He opened by asking her how she had been, which was unusual enough that she paid close attention to it. They talked for a while about small things, the station's catering, the scheduling of the next phase, the particular quality of the light in the outer observation ring, which was not natural light, but had been calibrated to approximate the light of 6 different member species' home systems simultaneously, and satisfied none of them fully. Then Duvan said, without transition, that he had reviewed the Conclave archive intake records for the past 11 years, and had found 43 reports submitted by Earth that had been received, processed, and never formally reviewed. Vasin said nothing. She waited. Duvan said that he wanted her to understand that this was not, in his view, a reflection of malice. It was a reflection of assumption. The conclave had assumed a certain order to things, and within that order, some voices had been weighted more heavily than others, and some reports had been read more carefully than others, and some ships had been expected to lose, and some had been expected to win. And assumptions, he said, were often the most durable form of blindness because they did not feel like blindness. They felt like clarity. Vasin looked at him for a moment. "Is that an apology?" she asked. "It is an acknowledgement," he said. "I am too old to pretend those are the same thing." She nodded slowly. "Then I will acknowledge that we noticed." Duvan made a sound that in Thalori meant something close to a quiet, rueful agreement. He asked her what she thought would happen now. She told him she thought people would start paying attention. He asked if that was enough. She said it was a start, which was a different thing, and that in her experience, starts were underrated. He walked her to the door of the chamber when they were done. He paused before opening it and said that he had been thinking about something, a human philosophical saying that he had encountered years ago in a cultural digest. He could not remember the exact form of it. Something about speaking quietly and carrying something large. Vasine smiled. A real one this time, small and unguarded, here for just a moment before the door opened and the diplomatic corridor came back into view. "That's the one," she said. There is a particular quality to the third day of a military symposium that does not exist on the first or the second. By the third day, everything that was going to happen in the formal exercises has mostly happened, and the results are sitting in the air of every room on the station, not discussed openly, not yet, but present. You can feel it in the way people move through corridors, in the way conversations pause when certain people enter a room, in the way eyes track toward displays that yesterday were background furniture and today are the first thing everyone looks at when they walk in. The final combined exercise was scheduled for the third afternoon. All 12 fleets, operating together in a large-scale defensive scenario against a simulated incursion force, a standard closing event for the symposium, designed to demonstrate alliance cohesion. The setup was familiar. The incursion force would probe the outer defense perimeter at 3 points simultaneously, and the combined fleet would respond and contain it. The conclave had run this exact scenario 7 times across previous symposiums. The containment usually held by the 40-minute mark, sometimes the 35th. The Resolute was assigned a secondary role, left flank support, which was considered a modest assignment, and was read by most of the fleet coordinators as the exercise committee's way of keeping the human ship visible, without giving it a position that would affect the main outcome either way. Stenger read the assignment and told Reyes privately that it was a careful way of saying they were not fully trusted yet. Reyes said that was fine. Trust was not something you were handed. It was something you accumulated, and you accumulated it the same way you accumulated anything else of value, by showing up and doing the work in front of people who were paying attention. She had his attention now, Stenger pointed out. Everyone on Arvith 9 had their attention now. She said that was different from trust, and that he should know the difference. The combined exercise began at the second hour of the afternoon period. The incursion force, automated drones running a pre-programmed assault pattern, hit the outer perimeter at all 3 probe points within seconds of each other, exactly as expected. The Conclave's main fleet group on the right flank responded immediately, the Sorathi and Duran vessels moving into their standard counter-formation, with the kind of precise coordination that years of joint exercises produced. The left flank was where things became complicated. The scenario designers had included a variable that had not appeared in the previous 7 iterations of this exercise, a delayed 4th probe, hitting the outer left perimeter at the 14-minute mark, coming through an approach angle that the standard left flank coverage formation left partially exposed. It was not a large exposure, a tactical gap of maybe 12 degrees in the coverage grid, the kind of thing that in most circumstances would be caught and corrected within a minute or two by any competent defensive formation. The problem was that at the 14-minute mark, the left flank formation was in the middle of repositioning to reinforce the center probe response. The timing was not accidental. The scenario had been designed to test adaptive response under competing demands. It was a good test, and under normal circumstances, it would have shown one of 2 outcomes. Either the formation adapted quickly and closed the gap, or the gap was exploited and the simulation scored a partial breach. What actually happened was that the Resolute was already moving to cover the exposure point at the 13-minute mark. It had not received new orders. Rays had looked at the incursion pattern from the first 3 probes, looked at the geometry of the combined fleet's response, looked at the gap that was forming on the left as the repositioning began, and had simply moved. Not dramatically, not quickly. The Resolute did not race to the position. It moved at a speed that could have been interpreted as routine, which meant that, when it arrived at the coverage point exactly as the 4th probe began its approach, it looked less like a prediction and more like a calm, obvious response to a situation that any competent commander would have noticed. 3 other fleet ships, watching the Resolute's movement, followed it. A Duran vessel and 2 Velhari ships adjusted their positions in response to what they saw the Resolute doing, which was exactly the right response, which closed the gap completely before the 4th probe reached it. The breach was sealed in under 90 seconds. The exercise coordinator noted, in the official record, that the left flank gap had been handled effectively by a coordinated multi-ship response. The Resolute was credited as one of 4 vessels involved. The notation was accurate and said almost nothing about what had actually happened. On the observation deck, 2 fleet commanders were watching the left flank footage independently and reached the same conclusion at approximately the same time. The Resolute had seen the gap forming before anyone else and had moved to cover it before the 4th probe was visible on any sensor array. Either the Resolute's sensor technology was significantly more advanced than anything the Conclave currently had, or its tactical system had run a predictive projection of the incursion pattern and identified the 4th probe before it launched. Neither possibility was comfortable. After the exercise concluded, a junior Sorathi officer named Drev found Nessa Rourke in one of the outer corridor access passages near the docking rings. He was not looking for her specifically. He was walking the passage because he found movement helpful when he was thinking, and he had been thinking since yesterday afternoon. She was standing at a viewport, watching the exercise ships return to their berths. He recognized her from the crew manifest that his intelligence officer had released to the Sorathi delegation that morning. The first human crew manifest the Sorathi had formally requested in 4 years. He stopped, he introduced himself. She nodded and told him her name, which he already knew. He asked if she had a moment. She said she had several. He was quiet for a short time, looking out at the returning ships, and then he asked her how long they had known about the sensor relay vulnerability in the Sorathi warship class. She looked at him. He had a direct face, and he was asking directly, and she decided to answer directly. 9 years, she told him. Give or take a few months. The first report was submitted to the Conclave Tactical Board 9 years ago. The vulnerability had been identified during a joint exercise analysis. It had been documented, referenced, and submitted through the correct process. Drev was quiet for a moment. Then he asked why humanity had not tried to use it before now in previous exercises. Rourke thought about the question. It was a good question, and it deserved a real answer. She said that in the first 3 exercises, the human squadrons had been trying to compete on the Conclave's terms, using the tactical approaches they had been taught were standard. Running the formations that had been presented in joint briefing materials as the expected framework. They had failed, and after each failure they had submitted reports with their analysis of why, and those reports had not been engaged with. She paused, then she said, "We were not trying to win a war, we were trying to be heard." Drev looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not softened, exactly, but changed. Like a surface that has been holding one shape and has found reason to consider another. He said carefully that he thought his people had made an error in not reading those reports. Not as a military admission, she understood that, but as a simple, factual observation. She said she appreciated him saying it. He asked what the compression fold drive was. She said she was not authorized to discuss the Resolute's drive systems. He accepted this with a nod that said he had expected it, and that he would have asked the same thing even knowing the answer. They stood together at the viewport for a few more seconds. Then he said he should return to his delegation. She said, of course. He began to leave, then stopped and said, not formally, just as one officer to another, that it had been a well-executed engagement. In Corridor 7 and in the afternoon exercise both. Rourke said thank you, and she meant it, and he walked away down the corridor and back toward the part of Arvith 9 where his people were waiting. Fleet Warden Orath made his statement to the Conclave Council at the formal closing session that evening. He did not retract the speech he had given at the opening ceremony. That was not the way he operated, and everyone in the room knew it. But he made a proposal, phrased carefully, in the language of practical alliance management, that Earth's fleet contribution status be reviewed and formally upgraded from provisional member to full military contributor, with all attendant rights and responsibilities. He cited the performance in the combined exercise as evidence that the review was warranted. He did not cite Corridor 7. He did not need to. Council Speaker Duvan put the proposal to a procedural vote on whether to open a formal review. It passed with 9 in favor, 2 abstaining, and 0 opposed. Orath voted in favor. He did not look at the human delegation when he did so. He looked at the council speaker. Vasine, sitting in her section, recorded the vote result in her personal log with a time stamp and 3 words. The review passed. Then she opened a channel to Earth and composed a message. Not a report. The report would come later, formal and detailed and filed through the correct process. This was something shorter, something she sent on a personal channel to the director of Earth's Combined Defense Assembly, who had appointed her to this post 11 years ago and had been asking her, at irregular intervals for most of that time, whether the conclave was listening yet. The message was 4 words. They're listening now. She sent it. Then she closed the channel, put her personal display away, and sat in the closing session with her hands folded in her lap while the rest of the formalities concluded around her. Outside the station's hull, the Resolute sat in its berth, dark and quiet and patient, the way it had been when it arrived, the way it would be again when it left. 6 months is not a long time in the life of an interstellar alliance. 6 months is a season, a budget cycle, the gap between one set of problems and the next. But in those 6 months following the grand military symposium at Arvith 9, the Galactic Conclave's relationship with humanity shifted in ways that 6 years of diplomatic effort before it had not managed to produce. Not because humanity had suddenly changed, but because the Conclave had finally looked. The formal review of Earth's fleet status concluded in the 3rd month. It was not a dramatic proceeding. There were no arguments, no floor speeches, no close votes. The tactical analysts submitted their full report on the Corridor 7 engagement. The Conclave's military oversight body reviewed it, reviewed the after-action reports that had been sitting in the archive for 9 years, reviewed the combined exercise footage, and arrived at a unanimous recommendation. Earth should be elevated to full military contributor status, with all rights and responsibilities that entailed. The vote passed without opposition. Orath's office sent a formal notification to the human delegation. It was correctly worded and contained nothing personal. Vasine sent a reply that was equally correct and equally impersonal. She was, by that point, already preparing for the next phase of work, the part that came after being recognized, which was harder in different ways than the part that came before it. Recognition, she had learned, was a door opening. What you did after you walked through it was its own question entirely. Admiral Dora Reyes gave her testimony before Earth's Combined Defense Assembly in the 4th month. She flew back to Earth for it on a regular transport, not on the Resolute, which was already in refit. The assembly chamber was large and formal and full of people who wanted to understand what had happened at Arvith 9 and what it meant going forward. She answered their questions for 3 hours. When a delegate from the Pacific sector asked her whether the conclave now respected humanity, she paused before she answered, which made the room pay attention. She said that respect was not quite the right word for what had changed. Respect, she said, was something you gave freely when you recognized something as worthy. What the conclave had developed was something different. It was awareness. They had become aware that Earth was not what they had assumed it to be, and awareness was the necessary condition for respect but was not the same thing. Respect, she said, humanity would have to continue earning. The conclave would need to continue demonstrating that it could meet humanity as an equal. The delegate asked if that was a two-way obligation. Reyes said it was always a two-way obligation. That was what an alliance meant. She flew back to Luna Station the next day. The Resolute was in the second of its 3 scheduled refit phases, sitting in a dry berth with sections of its outer hull removed and engineering teams moving over its surface in the methodical way of people who understand what they have and intend to make it better. It was a large ship. Sitting still in a berth with its systems partially open, it looked like something resting rather than something diminished. Priya Nand had not been resting. She had been in the engineering bay of the refit facility since before the formal testimony, working on the 3rd iteration of the compression fold assembly. The first iteration had worked. The second had been faster. The third, she believed, would be both faster and more precise, and would extend the position discrepancy window from a maximum of 11 seconds to a projected maximum of 19. She had also identified a resonance interference pattern between the fold assembly and the secondary shield matrix that she wanted to eliminate before the next deployment. And she had 3 possible solutions, and was testing all 3 simultaneously, because testing them sequentially would have taken longer, and she did not see the point in longer when simultaneous was available. A junior engineer on her team, a young man who had transferred to the Resolute program 2 months after the symposium, part of the expanded crew rotation that came with full contributor status, watched her work for the first week with the particular expression of someone who is trying to calibrate what normal looks like in this environment. He asked her once, during a break in the testing cycle, how long it had taken to develop the original compression fold design. She told him 4 years from initial concept to first successful test, 2 more years to reach the reliability threshold required for deployment. He said that was a long time to spend on something no one else had ever tried. She looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had heard a version of this before. The conclave has been using the same basic drive architecture for 400 years, she said. They've had no reason to change it. No one was threatening them. She checked a readout on the assembly. That's not a comment on their intelligence. It's a comment on their situation. When nothing challenges you, you don't build the thing that answers a challenge you don't have. He thought about this. He asked what had made Earth decide to build the fold drive. Nand said, "We needed something they didn't know how to counter. We had to build it ourselves because no one was going to give it to us." She paused. And because it was an interesting problem. The last part was said with no particular emphasis, but he understood that for Priya Nand, interesting problem was approximately the highest possible category of motivation and explained most of the significant work she had done in her career. Rolf Stenger spent the refit period the way he spent most periods of downtime, doing things with his hands. He had requested and received authorization to conduct a manual hull inspection of the Resolute's outer surface, the kind of inspection that was formally unnecessary, since the refit team's automated scanners would cover everything the inspection would cover, and would cover it more efficiently. But Stenger had spent his early years walking the exteriors of asteroid mining platforms in a maintenance suit, running his gloved hands along seams and joints and access panels, and he had found over the years that he thought more clearly when he was moving across the surface of a large object in the quiet of space. He was on the 3rd hull section, working at a methodical pace toward the aft quarter, when Nessa Rourke contacted him on the suit channel. Her voice came through with the slight delay of an encrypted personal channel rather than an open ship channel, which told him before she said anything that this was not a work call. She told him she had received her new assignment. First Officer, ISV Dawnwall, one of the 3 new Earth vessels that had been cleared for conclave exercises as part of the full contributor status package. She was to report within 8 weeks. He kept moving along the hull. He reached a seam junction and ran his fingers along it, checking the surface pressure with the particular attention of someone who knows what a properly fitted seam feels like and can tell the difference. "That's good," he said. "I thought so." A pause. "Will you miss working with me?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave most questions, which was more than most people expected from a man who spoke in as few words as he did. "The ship will miss you," he said. Another pause. "That's not what I asked." "Yes," he said, "I will." He heard her do something that might have been a laugh, or something adjacent to one. The sound people make when an answer that they expected is still better for having been said aloud. She told him the Dawnwall had a good crew. She said it felt strange to be moving on to something that existed partly because of what the Resolute had done. He said that was usually how it worked. One thing opened a door, and other things walked through it. She said she supposed that was true. He said it always was. She signed off. He continued his walk along the hull. Earth filled the viewport beneath him, large and blue and ordinary in the way that familiar things become ordinary even when they are not. Even when they are, in fact, the specific piece of the universe that produced everything worth caring about. The refit facility was in a standard orbital slot above the equatorial band, and from this position the continent shapes were clear in the way they were always clear from orbit, ancient and settled-looking, as if they had been there long enough to stop trying to be impressive and simply were what they were. The Resolute stretched out in both directions from the section where Stenger walked, enormous and incomplete in the way of things being made better rather than made for the first time. Its hull was dark except where the refit lights illuminated it, and those lights threw long shadows across the surface that made the ship look, from certain angles, like something geological rather than something built, something that had taken a long time. Stenger finished the junction check. He marked it in his log and moved on to the next section, his boots pressing lightly against the hull with each step, the suit's magnetic adhesion doing the quiet work of keeping him connected to the surface. Below him, Earth turned. Above him, the stars were there, the same stars that contained 11 other civilizations, their fleets and their histories and their long-held assumptions about who mattered and who did not. The stars that the Resolute would be going back out into, and into which 3 other Earth ships would now follow, and perhaps more after that, and perhaps more after those. Stenger was not a philosophical man by inclination, but he had lived long enough to understand that most things that looked like sudden changes were actually slow changes that had finally reached their visible point. The Resolute had not become what it was at Arvith 9. It had become what it was over years and years of work by people who believed that the work was worth doing even when no one else was watching. He reached the next seam junction and checked it the same way he had checked the last one, carefully, without hurrying, with the full attention of someone who understood that the quality of what you did when no one was watching was the only honest measure of the quality of what you were. He marked it in his log secure. He moved on. The Resolute held its berth and waited, patient in the way of things that are not finished, quiet in the way of things that have already said the important part, and know the rest will follow in its own time.